Alright guys, this is the third and final part for the notes for this formative. Today we're going to talk about solving quadratics with complex solutions. So we've already solved quadratics before. We had those four methods: factoring, square roots, completing the square, and quadratic formula. But now we're going to deal with it when we have imaginary solutions. Now a quick review. Remember the discriminant, that b squared minus 4ac, told us how many real solutions there were. So if it was positive, it was 2 real solutions. If it was 0, it was 1 real solution. If it was negative, it was no real solutions. And we used that part when we were using the quadratic formula. Now remember, when we had a discriminant was a negative, that discriminant's the part that's underneath the square root. So that had no real solutions, okay, when it was negative. But now we've learned what to do if I have a square root of a negative number. We can actually turn that into an imaginary number. Alright, so that's going to be helpful for what we're going to do today. Okay, here's a quadratic, okay, and we talked about solving quadratics. One of the big things that we talked about is when we have a quadratic formula, which I put off to the side, is something that will always work. So for these ones, I'm just going to use it because I know it's going to always work, whether it be real solutions or imaginary solutions. So let's go ahead and get our A, our B, and our C. Okay. The A for this is 1, B for this is 6, and C for this is 10. Now, I kind of remember you have to make sure that everything's on the same side. It has to be set equal to 0 before you get your A, your B, and your C. So let's go ahead and do the discriminant first. So I'm going to do 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10. Now 6 squared is 36 minus 40 give me negative 4. You remember, you can plug this top part in right into the calculator and it should give you negative 4. Now I have the opposite of B, so negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 4. And we just plug this right into our quadratic formula. All that over 2 times A, well, 2 times 1. Now let's clean this up. I have negative 6 plus or minus square root of negative 4. Remember, negative is going to become an I, and the square root of 4 is 2, so that is just 2i. All that's over 2 times 1, which is 2. Now the same thing goes when we have these three numbers. Okay, if a number goes in all three of it, we can divide those out. So 2 goes into all those. So I'm going to write it down here. I'm going to have negative 3 plus or minus 1i, or just I, all over 1. But really, we don't need that there, so I'm going to go ahead and just erase that, and we're just going to keep it as negative 3 plus or minus I. And that's our answer right there. Remember, that's two solutions. We have negative 3 plus I and negative 3 minus I. Okay, for this one, we're going to do the same thing. It's a quadratic, but first I need to make sure that everything equals 0. So this should be 10x squared plus 4x, and we're going to add that 1 over to both sides. So this should be plus 1 equals 0. Okay, now let's go ahead and do our A, B, or C. So our A is 10, our B is 4, and our C is 1. All right, now let's use that let's do the discriminant first. So I'm going to have b squared, so 4 squared minus 4 times a, which is 10, times c, which is 1. Now 4 squared is 16 minus 40. 16 minus 40, that's going to give me 24. Okay, so let's plug that in the quadratic formula. We have the opposite of b, so negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative, that was negative 24, sorry about that, negative 24, all over 2 times 10. Now let's clean this up. We don't know what the square root of 24 is, so I can break that down into 6 and 4. 4 is 2 and 2, and then 6 is 3 and 2. So I have a pair of 2's. Alright, so I have negative 4 plus or minus. That 2 is going to come out. And remember, we had a negative here. Okay, so we had to put an I now. Square 2 times 3 is 6. All of that over 2 times 10, which is 20. Now remember, the same thing goes if I can divide these three terms by something, I need to divide them. Notice I don't care about this 6. That's just going to stay there. Okay, so we're going to have negative 4 plus, sorry about that. We're going to have negative 4, 2, and 22 goes into all those. So we're going to divide them all by 2. So negative 2 plus or minus 1i, or just I, square root 6. All that over 2 divided by, or 20 divided by 2 is 10. And there's our answer for that one. Okay, guys. So I know I said quadratic formula works for every problem. Another one that sometimes is pretty easy and pretty useful is square roots. If we solve by square roots, remember when you use square roots, you have to have x squared and a number. You can't have just a single x term. For this one though, I'm just going to square root both sides since I already have x squared by itself. So I'm going to have x equals, remember you have to have a plus or minus square root of negative 10. Now, we can't have that negative inside of the square root, so let's go ahead and use what we know about imaginary numbers. Remember, you can take that negative out, make it an I, and then we're left with square root 10. Because if I try to break 10 down, it's just 5 and 2, and there's no pairs there, so I'm just multiplying them, and it's going to be 10. And hey, there's my answer. Now, really quickly, I'll do that in quadratic formula, just so that you can see that it still works out. You'll still get the same answer. But if I look at this, I'm going to go ahead and move this over so that I have x squared plus 10 equals 0. Okay. Now, my a is 1. My b is actually 0 since there is no b term. And my c is 10. So then we use the discriminant. So I'm going to have 0 squared minus 4 times my a, which is 1, times my c, which is 10. Which, when I multiply that out, I'll get negative 40. Okay, so we'll go ahead and plug that in. I have 0 plus or minus square root of negative 40 all over 2 times 1, which is just 2. Okay, now, let's go ahead and break down the square root of 40. Okay, that's 4 and 10, which 10 is just 5 and 2, and 4s is a pair of 2s. Okay. So when we go to kind of clean this up a little bit, we don't need the 0 there, so I can just have plus or minus. Remember, this is x equals plus or minus. We have to bring out that I, and also we have a pair of 2's. So it's going to be 2i. Then I'm left with a 2 and a 5, so that's going to be square root 10. All of this over 2. All right, now same thing goes. There's no, really there's a 0 out here that I don't have to worry about. But if you look at these two numbers, I can divide those by 2. So we're actually going to have plus or minus, x equals plus or minus, 2 divided by 2 is 1, so 1i, or just I, square root 10, all over 1, but I don't really need that 1 there, so my answer is right here. If you notice, our answers match up, which makes sense because the method can change, but our answers should not. What's the difference between solving quadratics with positive discriminants and those with negative discriminants? Well, just think, when we solve something with a positive discriminant, we end up having real solutions. Now think, when we did the square root with a negative in there, we ended up having to take that I out, so we actually had imaginary solutions. Okay, now go ahead and jot that down for your exit ticket and get started on your practice problems.